In 2015, residents in Flint, Michigan discovered that their drinking water had been contaminated with lead after the city switched its primary water source a year earlier. More than 100,000 people, including up to 12,000 children, were exposed, and nearly 5 years later, the city is still reeling from that water crisis.
One author is sounding the alarm, saying the threat of a more serious and even wider spread emergency is growing rapidly. In his new book, Troubled Water: What's Wrong with What We Drink, author Seth Siegel examines how communities are putting themselves at risk. Here to explain how we got here and what we can do to protect ourselves and our drinking water is Seth Siegel. Great to have you, sir.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Sagar.
Tell us a little bit about the book, why you decided to write it.
I decided to write it because I realized with my other water research that we face a public health crisis in America that no one is talking about. We think that Flint, Michigan is the one and only story, maybe Newark, maybe an outlier here or there.
Yeah.
But our water is widely contaminated. The EPA is asleep at the switch. The last time they have regulated or done anything on any drinking water contaminant is more than 20 years ago.
Wow.
This is a bipartisan failure, but it's also a bipartisan opportunity.
So what does the public health crisis look like? What is happening to people? What are the indicators that you're looking at?
Okay, so it's not what it was 100 years ago. People aren't dying of drinking water and dying of cholera a day later. That's not happening anymore. What's happening now is that water is filled with all kinds of micropollutants, microcontaminants that comes into the water through industry, comes out of our toilets and our showers, pharmaceuticals that flow through our bodies, get into our water supply, and then come back to us in very small quantities. In the same way that those chemicals are intended to do things like kill bugs or suppress weeds, in the same way those drugs are supposed to do things to our bodies in very small quantities to vulnerable populations, pregnant women, small children, immunosuppressed people, people on chemotherapy, and sometimes just normal, healthy people like us have impacts on our bodies from this. It happens slowly. We are seeing a burst of endocrine disruptions. We are seeing cancers that don't make sense from a genetic point of view. And the EPA is not doing enough to do enough research. And they are not helping. They are not helping to make sure that industry has the opportunity to do what it should be doing, and at the same time protecting our drinking water sources.
Give us some specifics on this, because I know I read a stat that, I mean, you have so many Americans on antidepressants that if you test the water, you'll find trace amounts of antidepressants, just as one example. But give us some more specifics on exactly what many of us may be drinking.
I'm going to tell you an example that'll blow you away. There's a phrase in the environmental movement that the solution to pollution is dilution. Okay, so the idea is that if you have a bit of contaminant in a vast body of water, you're probably okay. Okay, so this very enterprising scientist, professor, did a study of fish in the Great Lakes, the biggest source of fresh water in America, right? So just take Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, take anyone you want. She pulled fish out of the Great Lakes, and she found that more than half of them had in their brains and their organs psychiatric medicines. That's medicines that fish aren't depressed. They're not taking antidepressants.
They didn't get that prescription.
It's only coming through our wastewater treatment plants because our national water infrastructure was built about 100 years ago. And even though they've modernized, the technologies used are the identical technologies that were used way back when. It gets rid of what's called organic material, the stuff that goes out of our bodies, the stuff that goes down the sink from the chicken scraps and carrots and so forth. But they do nothing about the inorganic material, the pesticides, pharmaceuticals, and the whole wide array of about 120,000 chemicals and pharmaceuticals that go into commerce every single day in America.
Yeah. So Seth, what do we do about it? You talk a little bit about some new technologies and some other government actions. What can the United States do?
So my book is actually an optimistic book in a crazy way. It's optimistic because I say this is a completely solvable problem. You know, your guest who was just on a moment ago talking about climate change. If today we decided everybody agreed that we're going to fix this problem, it's such a daunting, enormous, huge generational problem. This is not the same case with drinking water. There are existing technologies and the reason at affordable prices. And the reason why I say it's an optimistic book is because I close my book with a discussion of Orange County, California, which some years ago made a decision that they weren't going to wait for the EPA. They made a decision they were going to have the cleanest water that science would allow them to have. And so they built out a system that costs only about 60 some odd cents per person per week, 30 some odd dollars a year. And the water is as pure can be. That's water that we all can enjoy. It can purify all that stuff out of the water. Industry can continue doing what they're going to do. The pharmaceutical industry can do what they need to do. All of us can live our lives and live healthier, happier lives. That's what we need to do. We need to have a rethink of this. If I may say, because this is Bill TV, the other great crisis we have, I don't normally talk about this, we have a failure of governance, not just at the EPA level, but some years ago, there was a proliferation of utilities. So you would think there were 50 states, every state should have at least 1 or 2 drinking water utilities, right? So 100, 200 maybe, that'd be an efficient number. There are 51,535 drinking water utilities in America. There are 200 just in Los Angeles County. They are so small, most of them. Some are very large, but very few. Most of them are so small that they don't have the capital base to do all the things they need to do, to hire top-tier engineers, to buy the new technology, to create the opportunities for infrastructure. And if you want to also segue into back to climate change, in California, about 18% of the state's total electrical use is just to transport, clean, and heat water. 18%. About a third of the water in the United States is lost to broken infrastructure leaks. You could save such an enormous amount of energy just by fixing our infrastructure. But because there are so many small utilities, we can't do that.
Right. Well, I've followed pretty closely. I mean, you talk about some of these extreme examples, Flint, Michigan being one, Martin County, Kentucky being another that I've followed closely. And you talk about a place, I mean, the infrastructure is aging, right? It's leaking into the ground. I think they lose something like half of the water, just leaks down of the system.
Some places.
And you know, this was a coal county, right? Really dependent on the taxes that they would get from the coal companies there. That's obviously dropped off. They don't have the money to fix it, and where's it going to come from? And so on the one hand, yes, you're optimistic if everybody got together and wanted to do something, but when it is so fractured, right? And when, look, Martin County is an extreme example where residents are having to go to springs to bring jugs of water to their home. That's how bad it is. But in places where it's not that bad, there isn't that sense of urgency to force politicians to actually spend the money to make these upgrades. So how do you do it?
Okay, so there's 2 thoughts. First thought is that just in terms of branding and focus of this, we should take drinking water and stop thinking of it as an environmental issue. I argue in my book that we should take it out of the EPA altogether and put it in Health and Human Services. It's a public health issue. It's really not an environmental issue.
It's true.
Second of all is I think you underestimate the power of the business community. And that is between public-private partnerships where you have private capital and public resources brought together. You have the opportunity to rebuild the national water infrastructure and then pay for it over a period of 50, 75 years. Those vehicles exist. Plus, by consolidating many of the very small water utilities we have, you're going to start finding the fixes because the rate base will grow. The types of people those new utilities could be hiring grow. And I'm completely agnostic, by the way, as to whether these should be public or investor-owned utilities. It's fine. Either way is fine.
It's more about size.
It's all about size. You know, it's sometimes the antagonists of my point of view say, well, look at Flint, 100,000 people. That's not a small system. Well, it's true. You can have a very bad, large system.
Right.
It is true. But the opposite is usually not true. It's very hard to have a fragmented system that universally provides great water. You can have individual, very small places that happen to have good source water and smart people there. But they are few and far between.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Seth. This is really great.
Thanks, Seth.
Thanks a lot.
Coming up, former FBI Director James Comey says he'll move to New Zealand if President Donald Trump wins another term. But what if he's defeated?
At Politicon this weekend, I talked to Turning Point USA's Charlie Kirk about the future of the GOP. That's next on Rising.